Hello everyone, it's time again for our next lecture series on the Cold War. And so what you see here in front of you is a map of the Eastern Bloc. And of course the Eastern Bloc are countries that we consider to be either part of the USSR, the Soviet Union, or countries that are also proclaimed to be communist, or countries that are under the sphere of control, at least indirectly, by Russia. And so, of course, the gray areas are areas that are either neutral or they side with NATO and the United States. So, the Iron Curtain. Following the advice of U.S. historian and diplomat George Kennan, the U.S. adopted the policy of containment. So, according to Kennan, the idea was that through containment, we could essentially build a wall of nations or buffer states in order to prevent penetration through communists. Because if you recall, we've seen in the past that Russia was rather aggressive in going into countries, even during World War II, and installing governments that were more friendly to them. Of course, with no regards at the opinion of the people who live there, except perhaps people who were part of political movements in the communist movement themselves within their home countries. You could say that similar examples could have been found with buffer states in Eastern Europe that were seen to ward off, say, the Ottoman Empire. Or during the time of the Romans, they had buffer provinces to help slow down what they saw as Germanic barbarians penetrating into the Roman Empire. And so this was seen to be a similar thing. Winston Churchill, following the war, he's going to come to the U.S. and he's going to make a big speech at a university. And this is going to be known as his famous Iron Curtain speech, where he says, "An iron curtain has fallen across Europe." Truman was attending this speech, and the term stuck ever since to represent what the Cold War was. So you could think of the Iron Curtain as an invisible barrier between communism and capitalism, or totalitarianism and freedom. The U.S., the United Nations, and Britain demanded that the Soviets withdraw from Iran. Following the war, the Soviet army had invaded Iran. Iran was a pretty small power at this time. Even during the days of the Ottoman Empire, Iran, or Persia as it's often called, just was a very small state, had its own little kingdom, but it was extremely impoverished and didn't have much going in the way of economy or even world events. The Russians left Iran without conflict because of this international pressure. This proved to the West that a strong stance needed to be taken against communist aggression, because they saw here an example of a country that was at peace invaded by communists, by military forces, and the fear was that they would do this to Europe or other places as well, using force of arms in the military to have kind of like these artificial revolutions. So, following the Iron Curtain, we have Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So, in 1947, President Truman announced America's new anti-communist foreign policy known as the Truman Doctrine. So, if you recall from History 1301, we had the Monroe Doctrine, which of course was a foreign policy statement that said that European powers were not allowed to interfere with the Western Hemisphere. Well, here the Truman Doctrine is rather similar in that it's a foreign policy statement that the U.S. would aid countries who were threatened by communism with both military and economic aid. One of the first actions of this new policy was started by Truman's Secretary of State, George Marshall. Marshall is going to help come up with something called the Marshall Plan. And this is going to help out with countries that are friendly to the United States. We're going to offer them cash, and loans and grants and supplies and things like that. And we're even going to offer this to the Soviets. Now, that's not saying that they wanted to help out the Soviets or communists, so to speak, but they were kind of calling their bluff, because if the Soviets accepted it, this would be a sign of weakness, and it might be a chance to bring them back into the Western sphere. Well, the Soviets rejected the aid because it would lead to Western economic integration and the purchasing of American products, and of course, national pride, an admission that maybe capitalists were doing okay and they weren't, and things like that. We're going to see as the Cold War drags on, there's going to be a lot of propaganda on both sides. And a lot of the Soviet propaganda is going to be that they're this magnificent agricultural and industrial output country, or collection of countries and nations that really outdo the West. And we're going to see that that's not necessarily the case, especially when we start talking about the agricultural plants and industrial plants are going to lead to massive disasters throughout communist countries. Here's a map of Germany following its division after World War II. We see the blue area is considered the area of France control. We have green for Great Britain, yellow is the American, and red is the Soviets. If you remember, Germany was being invaded by all four of these powers. Well, of course, I mean, France was set back on its heels, though they certainly were at war with Germany. And then you see Berlin is circled. That's because Berlin, the capital, was also divided, even though it was well within Soviet territory. So that's going to cause some problems. The division of Germany. In 1947, the Soviets announced the Molotov Plan to counter the Marshall Plan and incorporate Eastern Europe into their own sphere of influence. So they said, so you have an economic military plan to help your allies? Well, we have one too. Then in 1948, the Soviets helped overthrow the government of Czechoslovakia, which is a country in Eastern Europe. So this is once again a warning sign to the Americans and their allies that, hey, the Soviets are aggressively taking over countries and installing friendly forms of government. They don't always install communist forms of government, but at times we're going to see that they will install forms of government that are still totalitarian and friendly to them. The coup led to congressional approval of the $12.5 billion price tag attached with the Marshall Plan. So this is a lot of cash at that time. I mean, it's still a lot of cash today, but you have to think, the late 1940s, that was a significant amount of cash. If you ever have a chance to talk to anybody who was alive during that time period and they can tell you how cash could stretch back then the way it doesn't now, it'll give you a good indicator of just how much money that actually was back then. As the aid began to arrive in Germany, the U.S. helped Western Germany hold elections and draft a new constitution. So we're trying to learn some of the lessons that were not learned after World War I and led to World War II. Remember the economic strife and that was found in Germany. So we have the Marshall Plan. We're going to try to relieve some of that economic strife. We're going to try to help facilitate democracy and things like that, and human rights, so that maybe we won't have another aggressive state come back up under fascism. The Russians then blocked all traffic to Berlin, though the western half was under the protection of the British and the U.S. So if you'll recall, Berlin, the capital, a rather sizable city, was in the middle of Soviet territory. These folks still need food and supplies and things like that. They were not on their feet yet after being totally decimated by Allied forces in World War II. So this led to 2 million people being isolated in West Berlin, that's the western half of the city, 120 miles inside of Soviet territory with no support. Here you see a U.S. cargo plane bringing in supplies into Berlin. Here you see some pretty happy kids. kind of waving them on. Worldwide containment. Continue. Following the division of Berlin, British and American aircraft flew in an average of 3 planes per minute for months in order to bring the city supplies. Meanwhile, Truman sent B-29 atomic bombers, just like the ones that were used in Japan, to Britain to send a message to the Soviets, though no A-bombs were present. So they sent the bombers. This is it's a message to the Soviets, has a propagandistic value as well. Stalin relented by 1949 and allowed Berlin to be supplied through motor vehicles. So he gave up. He's like, okay, guys, y'all can use the roads. Go right ahead. The strong arm control that Stalin displayed in Germany led Western Europe to join the U.S. in creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, in order to contain communism. So that's its central mission, is to protect the free states from the communists. Following the formation of NATO, other agreements such as the Rio Pact and the Organization of American States were made to keep communism from the Western Hemisphere. So far, the Cold War is ramping up. We're going to see how things are going to start to get a little more ugly in the future, especially when we start talking about clandestine operations, where we have third world countries being controlled behind the scenes by the great powers. And of course, we're also going to talk about proxy wars and things like that. But that's going to end it for today's lecture, and thank you.